Secret Invasion is an 8-part miniseries from 2008. It was written by Brian Michael Bendis and illustrated by Lenil Francis Yu. This event is one of the most intentionally convoluted Marvel events. It may be the most event of all Marvel events, and it heavily influenced the direction of the Marvel Universe for roughly the next 2 years. Due to this influence, Secret Invasion deserves a certain level of scrutiny. So, let's examine this event in more detail. The plot is reasonably straightforward. The Skrulls decide to invade Earth and claim it as one of their territories. They infiltrate various Earth factions, embedding agents that activate at a specific time. This creates chaos and fear, and during the confusion, the Skrulls attempt to assume control of the world. But they don't. Objectively speaking, if one goes with the flow of the story, it's somewhat satisfying. For the most part, it has a pace that is well managed, and the plot is basic enough that one gets the gist of all that's happening. If one approaches it as a big-budget action story with high stakes, then it works as intended. It probably goes on for 2 issues longer than it needs to, but that's a somewhat minor point. Again, if all you need is the premise resolved, aliens invade Earth and the heroes fight back, then you get your money's worth. However, where the event fails for everyone else is providing context, resolving plot points, and, in some instances, basic logic. The relevant establishing details cannot be organically gleaned from the miniseries itself. To be fair, the missing backstory is provided in the one-shot Secret Invasion saga, which preceded the event itself. This one-shot works as an old-timey clip show, like one would see before a season finale of a TV program. And it's pretty standard for a one-shot prologue to precede an event to summarize all the important plot points, so this area of critique gets a pass. As for the backstory itself, one has to go all the way back to the original Kree-Skrull War from 1971. After this conflict, the Illuminati traveled to the Skrull homeworld and warned them to stay away from Earth. Naturally, the Skrulls didn't appreciate that threat. The Illuminati are captured and experimented on before making their escape. An ambiguous something is learned by the Skrulls during their captivity. This something is a complete genetic profile of all life on Earth. Through backwards engineering, they can replicate the superpowers of all humans, mutants, and the Inhumans, who are a blend of Kree and human genetics. Following this, the Skrull homeworld is destroyed by Galactus. To add even more disarray, the Annihilation Wave decimates the Skrulls and their territory. As a result, the survivors split into different factions. One such faction sets their sights on Earth. They intend to fulfill a prophecy that states when the Skrull Empire falls, they will go on to claim the Earth as their own. Earth being a high-value, religiously focused target is never explained. Side note: as some might point out, it was established in the Kree-Skrull War that Earth is the midpoint between the Kree and Skrull homeworlds. So following that logic, Earth is a good staging ground for a war. And keeping with that logic, it could explain why the Skrulls would be interested in controlling Earth. But that's from a military point of view. It really doesn't explain why Earth would be the subject of a religious prophecy. It just is because the story needs it to be. End of side note. So that's the backstory to the event. However, getting a full picture, one that addresses the texture within the miniseries, requires a lot of supplemental reading. The New Avengers, issues 40 to 45 in particular, are critical. This portion of the New Avengers is a retcon of events within recent Marvel history. In fact, a good portion of this series and the Illuminati series should have been an actual part of the Secret Invasion miniseries, not in an entirely different series that was being published concurrently with the event. To elaborate a little further, there are a few key points that are raised that are not addressed within the miniseries itself. The first is the quasi-religious reason for the invasion. Again, this is only addressed in New Avengers. We'll get back to this point in a moment. The second is, how did the Skrulls infiltrate Earth and then go undetected for a significant amount of time? Furthermore, how did Reed Richards provide that ability to the Skrulls? These are 2 separate but closely related questions. In fact, it wasn't Reed Richards. It was his Skrull doppelganger that made this discovery. But unless one reads New Avengers 44, that's information they'll never discover. Not to mention, this information is either a continuity error or an intentionally misleading piece of information. If it's the latter, then questioning Reed's involvement and then misdirecting the audience with misinformation seems kind of pointless. Certainly, it's similar in purpose to Tony Stark being told he's a Skrull. That is, it creates confusion and disarray, and, especially, distrust of those with authority. But it also lies there unresolved, so it's reasonably annoying as a narrative trick. The point being overstated is this. The miniseries is not self-contained. The religious reasoning and the assertion that Reed Richards assisted the Skrulls is not resolved, even though both points are raised within the miniseries, which is the important distinction. Both are given some weight in the story, but there's no answers provided. Getting those answers requires supplemental reading. The need to buy more material to get a complete picture contradicts the assertion, which was repeated frequently during this and many other events, that all one needed to read was the core title. This would allegedly provide a complete reading experience. While true if one is going for a surface-level read, it's demonstrably untrue for anyone else. There's a pretty large elephant in this event room. It's difficult to read Secret Invasion and not see the direct influence of Battlestar Galactica. The major plot beats seem directly lifted from that TV series. If the show wasn't an influence, it's an example of a rather striking coincidence. The first element that stands out is the quasi-religious motivation of the Skrulls. For no good reason, when they begin their invasion they say, "He loves you," which has the obvious implication that the he in question is some Skrull god. It's something that's never elaborated on, nor does it have any particular reason for being included. In other words, it's utterly random. Of course, it could be a slight commentary concerning zealots using their belief system to cause chaos. But if that's the case, it's undeveloped, shallow, and ultimately unnecessary. Literally, one can remove this bit of texture and it would not affect the plot in the slightest. That is how meaningless it is. This was a fairly significant element in Battlestar Galactica and crucial to the overall plot. The other Battlestar Galactica comparison is the Skrulls pass as humans and infiltrate the planet undetected. Furthermore, some of these deep cover agents don't even know they're aliens. Naturally, this element tapped into the contemporary cultural paranoia concerning sleeper agents waiting for an opportunity to attack. However, it's done with far more nuance in Battlestar Galactica. The obvious difference here is, Cylons are robots, while Skrulls are aliens. To be fair, the motivation for the invasion is also completely different. The Cylons are committing wholesale genocide, while the Skrulls want to occupy and rule. Although occupation and ruling is something the Cylons would also pursue in the year preceding Secret Invasion. And finally, there is the virus that infects and destroys Earth's defenses, leaving the planet vulnerable to an attack. This is exactly what the Cylons do in the original miniseries. As a side note, how does the system know this is an alien virus? Wouldn't it just be a virus? After all, to infect the StarkTech system, it would have to be written in StarkTech code. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't execute on the system since it was incompatible. Okay, yeah, that's a bit pedantic. End of side note. So, there are three major similarities between Secret Invasion and Battlestar Galactica. One weaker similarity is Jessica Drew trying to convince Tony Stark he's a Skrull. It somewhat mirrors what Six did with Baltar. Six suggested Baltar may be a Cylon and continually messed with his mind, making him doubt himself. However, this is a very weak connection, but worth mentioning in the context of the other, more noticeable similarities. The aftermath of this event was rather significant. It led to Dark Reign, a non-event type of event where the villains are, in effect, a shadow government. This was followed by the event, Siege, where the status quo is finally reset. The focus point of Dark Reign and Siege is Norman Osborn, who quickly comes to prominence at the end of Secret Invasion. Osborn suddenly gaining power may be the least organic element of the miniseries. To use a popular phrase, it seems unearned. Very unearned, especially within the miniseries. Other than murdering Jessica Drew on live TV, Osborn is, at best, a minor background character in Secret Invasion. While it makes dramatic sense for Osborn to become powerful and influential, that is, he'll clearly make a mess and create a pile of conflict, it makes no actual sense. In other words, it was something necessary to move the narrative of the Marvel Universe forward. Without Osborn in power, Dark Reign and Siege simply don't happen. But it's a pretty awkward transition. While Osborn had been running the Thunderbolts, so he did have a level of tentative trust, it's a pretty large step to give him control of the government's espionage division. Not to mention, he's the Green Goblin. Like, that right there should disqualify him from any position, other than running a supervillain hit squad. Overall, this further illustrates that there was a narrative for the Marvel Universe, a grand design, so to speak, that carried through from one event to the next. On the checklist of event elements, all 5 points are fulfilled. Heroes fight heroes, Although those heroes are Skrulls, still same difference. The intended effect was to show hot superhero on superhero action. There is a lot of death. Again, all of them are Skrulls, with the most notable being Jessica Drew. Vision gets his brains blown out, but is back in action a few issues later. So this panel is either shock value or a fake out or both. It's only being mentioned to avoid comments saying Vision was also a casualty. He wasn't. The problem established is Norman Osborn, a known psychopath taking Tony Stark's position, dismantling S.H.I.E.L.D. and establishing Hammer. He also takes over other government-run operations. So, yeah, the status quo is altered. The amount of lead-ins, tie-ins, and other one-shots is just massive. The final total, according to comic book reading orders, is 126 comics. To put that in perspective, it's on par with Civil War, which had 132 comics. World War Hulk and the forthcoming Siege had a significantly smaller amount of tie-ins and such, so Secret Invasion had a lot of push behind it, so to speak. In the end, in a further effort to be fair to the writer Brian Michael Bendis, Secret Invasion was the culmination of a lot of work done beforehand. In fact, the seeds were planted as far back as New Avengers #1 with the breakout at the Raft, which was arranged by a Skrull agent. And, of course, there was placing the fake Jessica Drew within the Avengers and keeping her true identity a secret. As a long-term conspiracy story, it certainly has merit. Therein lies the problem. Establishing details such as these, and many others, are not represented in Secret Invasion, which has the effect of making the event appear rather incomplete. Of course, not resolving all the plot beats brought up in the miniseries, then establishing an obvious, dangling plot thread also compounds this issue. With Secret Invasion, Marvel seemed to be redefining an event, or more accurately, solidifying what they identified as the successful parts of Civil War, duplicating it and ensuring it continued. Secret Invasion may have been an event, but it was also a market strategy to separate the most people possible from their money, then continue to do so with an open-ended plot established at the end of the event itself. Civil War may have been an experiment in this area, but Secret Invasion was Marvel committing to this strategy. On a purely theoretical, meta-commentary level, this seemed to be the point where Marvel went from being a comic book publisher into being a company that published comic book properties. One could speculate this event was the early stages of the term event fatigue. Naturally, DC was doing a fair amount to bring about this condition. That company certainly wasn't blameless. But with Secret Invasion, one could, in a metaphysical sense, feel exhausted trying to get a full picture of what this event was trying to accomplish. And if one thought about it too long, they'd get the sense that it was a grand, empty spectacle with a slight resolution but no closure. In part, the intent of the event was to set up the premise that would, presumably, lead to the next event. And, by extension, that next event would do the same. Admittedly, this is a cynical take, and perhaps a bit unfair to place that burden on Secret Invasion. However, if one examines how these Marvel events evolved, it's difficult not to suggest Secret Invasion is where this particular approach, resolving one issue while intentionally creating another, becomes readily apparent as a marketing strategy, not as an approach to publishing serialized adventures.